hemodialysis is a treatment protocol for anybody whose kidneys have failed. And the protocol is to go on a machine, go to usually a facility 3 times a week for 3 to 4 hours. So it takes up a big part of your life. And it's hard to deny. So you have to think about the immense power of denial to say, I don't need this, kind of like what your father was doing. I don't need it. And when I sat down with these patients in this study, I won't go into the details here, but basically we had 2 groups. One group that got usual social work care, kind of like, encouraging them or telling them all the risk factors that are involved if they don't adhere to this treatment. And then my intervention, which was getting closer to them and trying what we called understand the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive symptom, which just simply means, how does this work? The symptom is maladaptive because skipping dialysis, they're going to end up in the hospital and inevitably die. So I wanted to understand, how does this work for them? Why is denial so important? And it's so funny you said this, because you mentioned 2 things, narcissism and dialysis, which completely aligns with my experience and my own entry into this field.
Yeah, I can imagine those clients were difficult and would cause a conundrum, because my father was difficult as a client at the hospital.
Well, for you, this would be difficult, right? Because you had an investment in getting him to do something. You mentioned bribes. But for
right?
me, it wasn't
Yeah.
difficult because I didn't have, my only agenda with them was to help them better understand what's keeping them away, why they don't want to be here, and for them to talk about how much they hate it. And then for us together to begin to really unpack, why do they hate it? And I think you probably know this already, right, Darren? But for a narcissist to receive help is to admit a flaw. So that's incredibly difficult. And getting dialysis obviously is any medical care, as you mentioned, is receiving help. But then you have to admit that you need help, which is not easy, because then you're very vulnerable.
Yeah, it was impossible for my dad. He
Mm-hmm.
had to avoid any kind of shame reaction.
Yes.
And he was so easily triggered into shame
Mm-hmm.
that he just could not. And in fact, I ended up teaching his caregivers how to talk to him so as to not trigger his shame.
Yes.
Because what I eventually noticed, and not soon enough, unfortunately, for many of the nurses that he was mean to, was that if a nurse says, "Let me help you," he will fight them from that moment onwards. How dare you? He might even lash out and try to hit them if they're trying to help him, for example, from his
Yes.
wheelchair into a comfortable chair for dialysis. He might be swatting them because they've asked him, "Let me help you." But if
Mm.
they reverse it, because they're going to have to almost lift him from this to this and say, "Can you help me, Mr. Elliott?" He'd be like, "Oh,
Exactly.
yes, I can help you." And he would be compliant because he's a
Yes.
good person and he likes to help people. That's part of
Yes.
his self-image. But how
Yes.
dare you assert that I need your help?